Hello and welcome back to the Docker series. So this is part 4. In this tutorial, we're going to have a look at running Docker Compose with Django. In this tutorial, we're going to be utilizing Docker Compose, as I've already said. So I'm not going to be giving you an overview or a rundown or a theory lecture on what Docker Compose is. Let's just bake this down to the fact that Docker Compose allows us to create multi-container Docker applications. So that essentially means we can create an environment with multiple containers running multiple services to run our application or to serve our application. No doubt you're already familiarized with Django, the fact that we're going to need Python and potentially a database. Now, of course, we could use the default Django database, but this is just to show that we can create multiple containers utilizing Docker Compose, have them be connected together, and then serve Django from the Python container. So just before we start building this, just to confirm that by the end of this tutorial, you will have a Docker Compose configuration file, whereby we've created a multi-container Docker application, 2 containers, one a Python container, one container which will be a database container. They'll be able to communicate together. And then we'll have Django being run from the Python container. So if you're not familiar with containers and images in general, of course, have a look at the previous tutorials and then maybe come back to this tutorial and give it a go. Actually, before we start, it's probably worth noting that I am using Windows here, and that means I am using the Hyper-V manager to run everything. So again, have a look at the previous tutorials for setting up Docker on Windows. Now, if you are using Linux, for example, or Mac, I'll try and give you some instructions that might be slightly different from what I'm going to show you. But generally, it should just work this way if you're using Docker Compose. There are some small points that, for example, file systems on Linux, we may need to change the file permissions. But like I said, I'll point that out as we go through. So something that you might be interested in, which is kind of handy, gives you some different ways of controlling or at least viewing and managing Docker, utilizing the Docker extension for Visual Studio Code. Like I said, I will touch on it as we go through the tutorial and just show you what it can do. It's not mandatory, it's not required, but it's something that you might want to have a look at. So where we need to start is by just going into a new project. So here I have a new folder. There's nothing inside of this to begin with. That's okay. So we're going to generate Django through the process that we're going to take. So we're not actually going to need to install or create a virtual environment here. All the files eventually are going to be placed on the container, and we're going to be linked to that container, and we're going to be able to utilize Visual Studio to manage and develop our application here. But all these files are going to be synced to the container. So the first thing you're going to need to do is to configure or to create a Docker file. So there's no file extension here, it's lowercase there. There's no file extension here. Notice that here Visual Studio Code is picking this up because I've also installed the other, I think, extension which was on offer when you start utilizing Docker files. So go ahead and do that and create this file. To break this down, what is a Docker file? It's a text document that contains all the commands a user could call on the command line to assemble an image, at least how that's defined in the Docker docs. So essentially what we're doing here then is we're utilizing a Docker file here to build or assemble our image. So what we're going to do here is define what image we want to use, for example, and then we can define some of the parameters. And then in addition to that, we can then define some commands. And these commands are basically then executed inside of that image. So here we just ask ourselves, well, what's our based image that we want to use? Well, what we need is an environment that we can then run Django. So in order to do that, we can just find maybe an existing image in the Docker hub whereby we can do that. Now we know that we need Python, So essentially what we need is a copy of Python running on in a container. And that's obviously going to have a base component of Linux, and that's then going to have Python installed onto it. So that's essentially what the container will be. Of course, there's already an existing container that has that. So let's just head over to the Docker Hub. So over at Docker Hub here, we've got some existing images that we can utilize. I've typed in Python here. So let's have a look. So here it is. So let's go into Python. So this is going to basically just have, well, this image is basically just a base image with Python installed onto it. So remember, the base image includes a very slim version of Linux, and then we have Python installed. So you can see here that we can just use Python. Now, if we move down here, it does give you an overview on how to configure this, or some of the configuration settings. So from Python :3. So that's going to basically select, in this case, the latest version of this, which looks like it's using 3.10 of Python here. So have a little read through here. At any time you're a little bit stuck, you can obviously use Python 2 if you don't want to use Python 3, for example. And there's some different variations here of different commands that you can utilize: Slim, Alpine, the different types of Linux projects you can use on here, for example. So there's plenty of different settings that are available. So let's go ahead now, and we're going to utilize this image as our base image, and we're going to then install Django onto this image. So we need to configure our Docker file as such. So we know that we need from Python 3. So that's a command that's going to call that image down. And now we can set out some different environment settings. So our first environment variable here, Python unbuffered. This is a way to ensure that Python output, or the Python output, is sent straight to the terminal and it's not buffered. So basically, this is just going to allow us to see the output of our application in real time. Okay, so next up we have our working directory. So this is a command that's going to create a new folder if it doesn't exist. So that's going to be our working directory. And now what we can do is we can then copy over our requirements file, because we're going to need to tell our server, our container, what to actually install onto it. So we're going to create a requirements text in a second. You might already be familiar with requirement text files. Literally, it has a list of different packages that we want to install. So once we've done that, well, just to give you an example here, for example, so what we've done here is now we've actually, say, built this image, or we've downloaded the image, and now the image is running. So what we're doing now is we're just sending across some different commands to now configure that image. That's essentially what we're doing here. And of course, this is pretty endless what we can do here. But for example, we can run commands. So this is just a simple example. We could run a pip uninstall Django. Of course, that's not going to do anything because Django isn't installed, but it just gives you an idea of the fact that we can run commands in this image here, or once the container is started. So we can then go ahead and just install our requirements text file. Now, remember, this is just commands that we use already if you've utilized Django before. So pip install -r, or sorry, the switch or flag r, and then requirements.txt. Okay, so that's pretty much it really for our Docker file. That's going to, sorry for repeating myself, that's going to create or download the Python image from Docker Hub, or the Docker Hub, and then we're going to set this environment here so that we can print directly in real time to the terminal. And then we create our working directory. So this is where we're going to put Django in this folder here. Now we could just use any folder structure at this point. We could just create any file folder there. So I've just selected that for no particular reason. And then we're basically going to copy over the requirements text and then run the uninstall of Django, which doesn't exist. That's just an example. So let's just get rid of that because we don't need that. And well, actually, I do want to show you that because I just want to show that that is running when we create the actual container. And then we run the pip install switch our requirements, and there we go. So that's now set up. So next up, let's just create a requirements file. So I've gone ahead and we've done that. So just make a new file, a requirements text file. So here, for example, we want to install Django, and then we are also utilizing or going to be utilizing the Postgres database. So we're going to need this extension too to make that possible. So if you've already used Postgres before, you know that is just a standard extension that we install. Now notice here, for example, I've typed in more or less than 3 and less than 4. So this command here, now I don't want to go to Django and see what the latest version is. I just want the latest version installed. But what I don't want to do is, because I know that I want to install Django version 3, then I'm never going to actually install Django version 4 here. So put this in another way, this command here is going to basically check for the latest version of Django and install it. So it must be more than or equal to 3 and less than 4. So it's always going to try and pick the latest version up to 4.0. And then, of course, it won't pick 4.0. It will pick 3.9 if that exists, for example. So that's just a shorthand of selecting the latest version of something. And now that is completed. So next up, we're going to need a new file. And this is going to be a Docker Compose. And this is going to be a YAML file, so YML. There we go. So now we have this file here, this Docker Compose file. So like I previously said, Docker Compose is going to allow us to define or create multi-container Docker applications. So here in this file, I'm essentially going to set that up. I'm going to define all of my images that I want to use in this multi-container environment. So the first thing I do here in the Docker Compose file is just basically define the version of Compose that I want to use. So there are several versions of Compose file format. So one, I think 2.x and 3.x, for example. So here we're going to be utilizing 3.8, which of recording is the latest version or latest Compose file format. And that will run on the Docker Engine 19, I think 03 plus. So this is just the latest version. So now what I need to do is define my services. So again, just remembering the fact that I'm trying to create a multi-container environment here. So now I'm going to create my services, which are the containers that I want to use. So I can name these containers. So that's a good place to start. So let's just go ahead, and name this service. So this is going to be the Django service. Now let's remember that the Django service is utilizing the Python container. So what we need to do is, first of all, define that. So we can just do that by typing in build, and then we're just going to use the dot to refer to the fact that we're going to use the original and the initial image, which is going to be the Python container. So next up, what we can do also, there's lots of things we can do here. It's endless, but we can also define the container name. So when the actual container is running, we can give it a recognizable name if we want to. So here I'm just going to call it Django. Okay, so next up, let's remember that we're trying to create an environment. So we're also going to pass to the environment commands to get things working. So of course, when I run this container, what I want to do is obviously run the server, the Django server. So I'm just going to run a command. This is the command here. We're all familiar with this command, hence I'm not just going to type it out here. So this is just a standard command, python manage.py, and then run server. And I'm running this on the 000 and then 8000. Okay, so that's just going to run on the server, on the Python server. So next up, what we can now do is define our volumes. So volumes is a topic which is a little bit advanced, and we will move towards volumes definitely, because we need to understand that when we start thinking about persistent data with within our containers and so on. So let's just set the volume, in this case, to the actual directory, what we defined earlier within our Docker file, where the actual files are going to be residing. So here, user, src, and then app. So I'm just following that path there. So next up, I'm going to need to utilize ports. So here, for example, we know that Django runs on the 8000 port. So in order for us to access this, now remember this is happening in our container and we're on our computer and we want to run this within our browser. So what we need to do is we need to map over the port from the container to the port on our computer. So we simply do that by setting out ports. Let's just do that again. So ports, let's just make sure it's in the right space here. So ports, so we're mapping across 8000 to 8000 so that when we access this container with this service, that's going to map over this port over to 8000 on our machine, and then we're going to be able to see this server running. So I've mentioned many times before, let's remember this is a multi-container environment. So the last thing that we want to actually configure is the dependencies. So we now say, well, what other containers do we want to run? Or what other containers is dependent within these services? So now we're going to set up the Postgres database container. Now I've just called this PGDB. So Postgres database there. So let's now go ahead and now set up this new service. So similar to what we've done here, where we set out this first container with our Python image, we now need to set out our new image, and we're going to call this PGDB. So this is matching up here, our dependencies here, to this new service. And now we need to define the image because we've not done that so far. Remember the build here, we're just utilizing Python. So what we can now do is set out a new image. So we can give this an image name like this, for example, but of course we want to use an image that already exists. So we want to use the Postgres image from the Docker Hub. So let's go back into the Docker Hub and let's just type in Postgres. Let's see if we can find this. So this is the official image. It's got 1 billion downloads, pretty popular. So you can see here that it's called Postgres. So we're going to need that information. So let's just go back to our file and we're going to say the image Postgres. So that's going to be pulled down from the Docker Hub to our machine. So now we've selected our image, we can now go ahead, for example, similar to what we did previously, we can set out the container name. So I'm just going to call this PGDB. So that's going to be my container name. And now we can set up some other environment variables. So again, it's just about going back into here, familiarizing ourselves with what's available. Now there are some setup guides, for example, here. Now what we want to do here is set out the initial database. So we can create a new database. We're going to call that Postgres. And then we need a username and password. So we can set the username and password. So this is just all these instructions here, the database and so on. So these are all optional environment variables that we can utilize. So go ahead and read those. Let's just go ahead now back into our file. Yep, there we go. And now we're just going to set out some environment variables. So like I said, we're going to need the database name, Postgres, the user, and the password. Okay, so there we have it. Would you believe it? That's literally all that we need to do at this point. So just to confirm, we've created our Docker file. We've created the initial image download. We set up some environment variables and some commands to run. So we're going to run the requirements text. We set up the requirements text. So we're going to install onto that image the Django server and also the configuration or the extension, sorry, so that we can connect to our Postgres database. So I've completely cleaned out Docker here of all the containers and images. So I don't have anything running here. It's completely fresh. Everything's working fine. Like I said previously, I'm utilizing Windows. So we're flicked between this and the command prompt to give you an idea, because this is going to make it easier for us to perform actions in actual fact. But we'll get familiarized with some of the commands as well. So we'll do the similar things with commands and utilizing this interface. In addition, I've added a new file here called commands.txt, and I like to just add some commands here just so that if you don't remember them or To save you going through the video again, just looking for a command, I'll place all the commands here in this file as we go along. I've already done that. These are all the settings and commands that we're going to be utilizing. So let's go ahead now and actually action our files here, our Docker file and Docker Compose file, so that we can actually get things running. So what we're going to need to do is type in Docker and then Compose. So we are using Docker Compose, and then we want to run Django. So if you remember, what is Django, what is referring to here? Let's just go back into the Docker file. So there's nothing here, but remember we're using Docker Compose. So we're going to run the Docker Compose file. So let's just remember that we're going to literally, we're saying we'll run this, Django. Now remember that this is hierarchical almost, because we're going to run through this. It's going to build. What is it going to build? Well, it's going to build the Docker file. So it's going to run through all that. And then it's going to do all of this here. So eventually it depends on this. So once it's configured all this, it's then going to look for this other service, which has an image, and it's going to go ahead and download that and set that up. So we're working from top to bottom here. So let's just go back into our command. So you can see that we're going to run Docker Compose run and then Django. And then what we want to also do is we want to pass over a new command, Django admin, and we want to start project. So this is going to run right at the end once it's all configured, and then the core. So we use the dot because we want to run it within the folder and not make a new folder within a folder. Just kind of basic Django setup code there. So that's going to run once everything's finished. So let's go ahead and run this. So this is going to take a couple of minutes maybe on your connection because we're having to download all the images. Because remember, we're asking for 2 new images. They're pretty hefty files, so they might take a little while to download. Okay, one of the steps that you might have to do as this process is taking place is that Docker desktop file sharing window will appear at the bottom right hand corner. You can't see it on mine, but it says, do you want to share it with Docker desktop? And just select share it. That's absolutely fine. So here we're nearly done. And we are now done. So let's have a look to see what's happened. Let's go first of all into the Docker admin here, or the Docker dashboard, sorry. So you can see what's happened. We've got in images now, we've got 3 images. So remember, we've created an image for Python and an image for Postgres. So we needed those images and we needed to utilize those images. And notice now we also have the Django. So this image is in use and this Postgres image is in use. So essentially, if I were to try and summarize what's happened here, we downloaded Python and Postgres image, and then we've gone ahead and customized Python to make a kind of a new super image with all our new settings. And now what we're doing is we're running 2 containers. So if we look in here, for example, we're stacked up. We're running 2 containers, the PGDB container and the Django container. So you can see that says exited there. So if I were to go into here and, for example, just run it, you see it says here, overlaying a project into an existing project won't replace conflicting files. So there seems to be a problem here, but don't worry about this. That's absolutely not a problem. Just go ahead. We'll sort that out in a couple of seconds. So just stop that if you can. Okay, so we've just stopped that. That is not a problem. So that's the first step done. If you got to this point, everything is absolutely fine. So what I see some students do is they get a bit worried at that point because it's not working, and then they try go ahead and run the command again. But let's just remember that command we run previously, that command, and let me just get this up so you can see it a little bit at the bottom here. This command here has all the setup features. So if we run this command again, we're just overwriting or trying to overwrite all the settings that we've already done. So we've created everything. So we've done and created all the settings and we've applied them. So we don't need to worry about that. So let's think about now Django. So in order for us to actually see the project, let's remember in the settings, we've got the allowed hosts. So just to make things easy for now, let's just make all hosts. So we use the star there to say all hosts, so we don't need to configure different IP addresses, etc. Okay, so that's done. And now let's just go back into the Docker area here. In the containers, let's just delete this container. Yep, about to remove that. Let's remove that container. That isn't a problem because we've got our image here and we can just run our image again. So let's go ahead now and have a look at the requirement or the commands here. So we're going to use Docker Compose up now. So let's give this a go. So Docker Compose up. You can see we've got up and down, so we can move it up and down. We can start and stop the service. So let's use up and see what we got. So you can see in my terminal here, it seems to start the database first. It gives me some information. Success, you're now running the database. And then we seem to go ahead and now actually run the Django. So you can see at the end here, it says you have 18 unapplied migrations, as you might imagine when you create a new Django. Notice I didn't mention before, but our Django projects actually appeared over here when we created the initial command or applied the initial command. Now, you can see it's running. So let's go ahead and test to see if this is actually working. So let's open up a new tab and we're going to run localhost, and there we go. So essentially what we've done now is we're running Django within our container. So let's just be sure that we understand that is the case. So let's go back into our containers. You see we've got our stack here. We're running the database. Remember, we named it, and the Django server. So this container here is running a lightweight Linux version. It's running Python, and remember, we've installed Django onto it. So that's what we're running. Now, notice here it says port 8000, because remember, that's what we applied, or that's what we assigned, port 8000. We're running on obviously 8000 there. So that's what we made that binding, didn't we, when we set up the configuration. So let's just find that. Apologies to go over this explicitly. So we made that binding in the Docker Compose file right here, the ports. So everything is running nicely and it's working exactly how we wanted to. But of course, we've got some unapplied migrations. So let's just go through this process and how you might achieve this. So if you remember from the previous tutorial, we can actually port into the container. We just need to know a little bit about the container so we can identify it and then we can move into it. So we can run the docker ps command. That's going to show us a list of all the running containers. And then we can use the ID or we can use the name of the container. This is just stacked a bit. If I just move this across, you can see that it's just where it's folded. So we've got the container ID, or at the end, you can't see on mine, it's got the name, and that's what we assigned in the configuration file. So mine's just called Django, so I can go ahead and do a Docker and then exec, and then I can use the switch or the flags int to kind of create an interactive terminal. And then we're going to port into the Django container, and then we want to use bash. So that's going to create an entry point into the container. And now we're actually inside of the container. And there we go. So I can now list all the files. So it puts me into the right directory, or the directory that I've installed Django. So notice that's user src then app. And that's what we set up on our Docker file, src app. So that matches that up. So let's just go back here and just give you an overview of what's happening here in general terms. So these files here, they are being linked to our container. So for example, if I were to run an mkdir, make a random directory, notice over here, we've just created a new directory. So vice versa, if I would update anything here, it would then appear in my container. So if I just delete that, move to recycle bin. So yeah, that's what's happening there. So more about that in a future tutorial. Essentially what I'm saying and what I'm showing you is just some general overview of how to kind of configure Docker Compose and get things working. When we start thinking about persistent data, because remember that whatever we do in the container, at least initially, once we close the container down and delete it, for example, then everything's gone. So it isn't saved. Remember, everything we do in the container isn't persistent by default, and it doesn't get moved across, or it doesn't affect the image or the initial image. So like I said, we'll sort that out in a different tutorial, but for now, let's just move across. We've seen that we can now port into the container, which means we can run commands because we're just inside of the container, which is running Linux, which has everything set up like our normal host. So we can run migrate. Sorry, I'm not in Windows anymore. Migrate. There we go. So that's just going to migrate like normal. Okay, so now what we can do is I'm just going to open up another terminal here. Now I've given you some commands on how to get into the Postgres database. So we're going to need to docker exec again, use the same flags, and this time our service was called Postgres. Oh no, in actual fact it was called Postgres DB, wasn't it? That's what we called it. And now what we want to do is once we go inside is to run a command. So with the database, if you're not too familiar with utilizing Postgres databases, we need to log in. So we open up the PSQL and then run our user through this. So we're going to basically log in as the Postgres user. Now remember, that's what we set up again in our Docker Compose file at the bottom here, the environment variables, the user. And remember, we also set the database and the password. So let's just go back here in our commands. So you can see now we've kind of passed that through and we can now kind of connect to it. So we don't need shell in this case because remember Postgres has its own command prompt. So now we're in Postgres database. So we're now inside the other container that we created. So there's a few commands here that we can utilize. So for example, /c, and then the name of the database, which was Postgres. Remember, that's what we created. We can now see that we're connected to that database. So again, if you're not too familiar how this works, we've logged into the Postgres shell. And now what we've done is we've actually now logged in or selected a database. Because if we want to perform any actions on a database, the first thing is we need to select the database. So that's what we've done. So now what we can do is have a look to see what's available. So the /d, it did not find any relations. So let's just go back and have a look to see what we've done. So what should have happened was, remember we applied our database, but what I've just realized is we've not actually connected our database up, and we're actually running from the SQLite database. I do apologize, but we've kind of moved the step across, so we'll just continue. Let's just delete this. Let's go to settings. Of course, if you're familiar with setting this up, you know you need to go to databases. Now the commands, if you're not familiar, I've already set them up here for you, so you don't need to worry about that. So let's go into the settings, overwrite the existing database, and now we're going to be utilizing the Postgres database, name and user, that's all matched up, and the password, remember, that's matched up with our Docker file, and the host. Now the host is the name of the, if you remember, the host is going to be the name here. This is the service, PGDB. So we utilize that, and now we use the port. So this is just a default port that the Postgres database uses by default to allow services to access the database. Now we don't need to do any port forwarding or mapping a port, here, because we aren't actually connecting to it. The container is connecting to it, and that's technically in the same environment. So that would just be able to access that container on that port. Okay, so now we've got that. What we're probably going to need to do is go ahead and just move this up and down again. So let's do a Docker Compose and then down. So just, I'm in the wrong terminal. Okay, so obviously I need to be in, I can control and see this in actual fact, but I just wanted to show the command. So I've opened up a new command prompt. So Docker Compose and then down, and that should just shut down things nicely. There we go. So remember, nothing is persistent here. So when I do move it up again, remember we're just going to start how we began with. So that means I need to then migrate the data again. So you can see potentially we've created a connection and everything's okay. So Postgres init process complete and is ready. So now everything is started and is ready there. What we can now do is, if I can open up the right command prompt here. So this is the command prompt I was utilizing to access the Django container. So I can do that again. So that should take me into the Django container. And now I can go ahead and run a Python manage py migrate again. There we go. And now, yes, and now we can go back into the second or the third here. And this was our Postgres database. So maybe we don't need to log in again. I'm hoping. No, we're going to log in again. So remember, we're going to port into the container, the base Postgres container. We obviously need to select our database again. And the name of the database is Postgres. So that now connects us to the database, and then we can run the D again, and you can now see our database is full of tables. Of course, if you want to remove, or if you want to get out of this, you can use the Q. That removes or gets out of that or quits that. Okay, so there we go. That's kind of the basic overview here. You now see that we have our services running. They've been set up. We've migrated the database. Django is most definitely working still. Let's just double check. There we go. So from this point, what we can do, of course, is we can start building our application. Because remember, anything we do here will then be mirrored across to the container. But like I said, the biggest issue here is that nothing is going to be saved. As soon as we stop our remove our containers, then that's where all the settings will be removed, and then we have to start again. So we need to move into further tutorials to learn a little bit about volumes and how to save data. It's a little bit trickier with databases in how the data is saved. So yeah, we need to learn a little bit more about volumes, and then we can progress this a little bit further. Okay, so hopefully you, I was going to say, enjoyed that. Hopefully that was useful and has given you a good overview and a good foundation now into Docker Compose. And the general components there, of course, there's hundreds of commands that we can use there. Of course there is, and configurations, but that hopefully gives you a good foundation to now for us to build upon. Like I said, and I do apologize about the persistent data. I do want to go over a little bit more because it goes into a little bit of detail and can be a number of different steps. And I just wanted this tutorial not to be too long and overbearing because this content can get a little bit tricky. There can be many problems that can occur on different operating systems and so on. Now, one thing I didn't mention that I said I would mention was the fact that if you're using, for example, Linux, it might be that you need to actually configure or just define who the owner is of the files. So here, for example, this is inside of my Django container with Django. If I list here, I can see that all these files here. Now, with Windows and utilizing the Linux subsystem, I know that these files will be the permission of the user, which is me, and so it works okay. But you may need to configure the permissions differently if you are using Linux and maybe Mac OS. For example, here, if I were to run ls with the L, you can see that I'm the owner here. So what you're going to need to do potentially is run a sudo command and then just a chown. So change the ownership to you, which is the R, and then if I remember, it's just a user. I can never remember if it's user and then also user as well. So you can check this up, but that's the general principles there. If you're using a different system and it's not quite working, you might need to change the ownership. So another thing I didn't mention, I might as well mention it now, is the Docker app here, or extension. So you can see here we've got the containers open. We can click and view the logs, attach the shell. So we can utilize this. It just can speed up the process of accessing these different containers and doing certain tasks, similar to this here. Obviously, we can start and stop things here and go into the CLI inside of this dashboard or administration tool. It's just another area which we can manage. And here, for example, we do have networks to have a look at, and volumes, and that's something that we need to obviously talk about in context. So it does provide some valuable information, and our images here, it does provide us some valuable information if we wanted to just integrate everything into Visual Studio. And again, it's all about different workflows. Some of you will just want to use command prompts all the time. Some of you don't mind potentially utilizing some of these tools here. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. If there's any feedback, please let me know, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.